All right, I think we're going to get started, and hopefully, yeah, a few more may join, but let's keep the whole thing on schedule. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the second episode of the international series of 60 Minutes to Understand. Our format today remains the same. We are inviting in-house and external experts, aiming to find the right balance somewhere in between, the content for dummies and the too academic content. And our ambition, again, is not necessarily to give you all the answers, but rather to help you ask yourself the right questions to eventually find the right answer. Ultimately, we want to help you take action and move forward in terms of climate action and environmental action. Today is going to be a sort of a step up from our previous webinar, as we're going to deep dive and take a closer look into forest-based carbon removal credits. I guess you're all familiar with the debate, one might say the scandal, around big parts of the voluntary carbon market. And indeed, it entails a lot of different things. And today we'll walk you through the part that, if properly addressed, can be among the safest, most durable and efficient options we have at hand. So our speakers today, are going to be Dave Duval. He's got a studied academic background and the co-founder of thinkco.ai. I'll let him introduce himself. Then Pierre-Alexandre Givou is our carbon expert and our head of product and innovation at EcoTree. And then Arnaud de Grave, our forestry expert, scientist, professor. He's got many titles. Some even call him our guru, but I'll let him introduce himself in his own terms. So today we'll start with Dave and his particular relevant insight in terms of the climate emergency. His angle and his specific approach is quite eye-opening. So thanks again for joining, Dave. Pierre will then walk us through the specificities everyone should be aware of when approaching nature-based carbon removals. And last but not least, Arnaud will deep dive into and demystify the power of trees and sustainably managed forests when it comes to carbon sequestration. A few final practicalities and we're good to go. This session will be recorded and available in a replay for you to share. You'll get an email from us after the session with the link to the replay and a few additional sources. And there will be room for Q&As, so no need to interrupt or raise your hand during the presentation. Just drop your questions in the dedicated Q&A section in the Zoom toolbar, and our team will curate them for the last part of the session. So I've now spoken well enough. Dave, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot, Thomas, for the kind introduction. So very quickly, a few words about me. So as Thomas said, I have a fairly long background in academic research, mostly around data science and matters of machine learning, which led me eventually to co-found Thinkco a few years ago, where we conduct data analytics, mostly using remote sensing data and a few other sources of data, such as economic data, in order to help companies, businesses measure their impact and their exposure to climate-related events, physical impacts and economic impacts on their activity, and of course, build their resilience from that. So today, I will try to focus on a few items out of the very wide topic of climate change and the climate crisis, which are essentially the time frame. I want to really outline how the commonly held conception of the time frame for the climate crisis is widely off, and we really need to rethink how we see the climate crisis in terms of when and how soon things are going to start to happen. The second and third parts are essentially how does that translate not just in terms of physical impacts on the ground, on humans, populations, the environment, ecosystems, but also on the economy and more specifically on companies, businesses, because this is a topic that, while understandably slightly secondary to the more important topic of human survival, is actually quite important, especially if we're hoping to make businesses understand how likely they are to be impacted, and therefore how important it is to for them to act on both mitigation and resilience. So first off, the time frame. Most generally, I hope we don't need to convince anyone here of the reality of climate change. I think we're past that. But generally, when people think about climate change, we are talking roughly of a 50 to 100 years sort of time scale. A lot of the previous agreements, the previous white papers, the IPCC reports, all tend to focus on milestones are in 2050 or even the end of the century. And conversely, a lot of the climate action tends to have these years as sort of targets. The reality is, unfortunately, a lot more short term. Next slide, please. If we look at the current trends, the trends of the past couple of years and the updated models, both the current models are being published by the World Organization for Climate, the IPCC, general scientific consensus, we are essentially on course to hit what was considered a hard threshold by the IPCC about 5 years ago. We are on course to hit that by the end of this decade. As we've seen this year, we are already on a very steep change course. So essentially, we are talking about a decadal time frame, definitely not a centennial one. Next slide, please. On top of this, not just the duration, the time frame, but also the speed of that change is generally badly understood. And one of the reasons for that is we tend to speak in averages. A lot of the milestones, a lot of the targets and goals are set in averages, average climate warming, average warming for the entire globe. The problem with that is what we are dealing with is a very large and complex system where there's something called homeostasis. That's essentially the ability of the Earth to revert to the mean, essentially. And what that means is that even with a certain amount of change in temperature, we always tend to fall back in a certain equilibrium. The problem with that is that this equilibrium is likely to change. There are different tipping points, and by tipping points, I mean events that once passed cannot really be reversed. A good example of that is sea ice melting, the polar ice caps. Other things are permafrost in Siberia. Once it melts, in order for it to thaw again, you will need a lot more effort back to move the temperature down. And so as a result of that, it's not so much the average, but also the variation, the variance in temperature that's important. And what we're seeing currently is that even though the average is steadily climbing, the variance is climbing even faster. And as a result, we are quite likely to pass these tipping points. And once we pass a tipping point, what happens is that we get into a new equilibrium. Essentially, there's no going back, and that means the average temperatures will automatically suddenly shift up. All this, in addition to the fact that we're dealing with a lot of feedback loops. So the same thing that are generally tipping points are also feedback loops, in that the more the ocean warm, the less able to capture carbon they are, the more the ice caps and snow in general melts, the less reflectance we have and the more warming we have, and so on and so forth. So this is not a linear effect. The more warming we have, the faster warming happens, is essentially the idea. And also there are a few fairly hard to predict, very hard thresholds that once passed will precipitate warming even more. And while there's absolutely no consensus on where and when these tipping points are, the general consensus is that they're much closer than we thought. They are definitely not at the end of the century. They are somewhere in the next 10 to 20 years, maybe. And that means fairly major effects in terms of warming. What effects? So first, of course, it's a direct impact on the ground. Essentially, it's water, it's temperature. We've seen fairly major evolution this year in a lot of areas, typically wildfires. Wildfires in Canada have blown absolutely every past records. We're not talking about a sort of steady increase. We're talking about an exponential, manifold increase from past records. Same with droughts, same with a lot of things. The lower right corner graph is actually a data analytics project we had, which is collecting 1,000 years of data on the average day of the year where cherry blossoms in Japan blossom. And as you can see on the right, there is a fairly major trend and a fast one at that. And we can't really see the very last few data points, but over the past 5 to 10 years, that trend has gone even further and faster. So from these physical impacts, we are all quite familiar with what could happen in terms of the impact on population, on ecosystems, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. But one aspect I want to sort of narrow down on is that it also affects businesses. And while that's certainly not the first thing that we should have on our mind, it does also mean that a company has a vested interest in avoiding climate change. It is not just a matter of regulatory pressure, is what I'm trying to say here. What we are seeing and what was outlined, especially in the IPCC reports, is that when a climate event threatens the ability of businesses, for example, to transport their merchandise, to produce, to access commodities and resources that are needed for their business. Not only does that impact the local area, but in our very highly connected world of logistics nowadays, it will impact practically all business the world around. There are many examples of that, and one fairly old example, but which was fairly striking, is Thailand in 2011. So that's already fairly old, and by now, nowadays we have even worse climate events. But in 2011, Thailand experienced floods on a scale that had not been seen ever. What happened is large area of the north of Thailand was flooded practically nonstop for about 2 or 3 months. The direct economic impact was fairly dire. Entire provinces, as you can see the middle map, so it's a large province north of Bangkok, were flooded and unable to operate. The economy was frozen. But what's more interesting is that the indirect economic impact was much, much larger. The area that was flooded happened to be a very heavy industrial area. It produced especially computer or automotive parts. As a result, not only was basically the entire country's economy brought to a standstill, the global economy was impacted that year for about 3 to 4 months. A number of automotive factories the world around, especially in Japan, in Mexico, in the US, even in Europe, essentially had to stop for 2-4 weeks because they ran out of parts, because one country at the other end of the world was flooded unexpectedly and in ways they were not prepared to deal with. And this type of small local effect with large global consequences has only been increasing. Another example, very quickly, is typically we are seeing more and more repercussions on commodities, agri-businesses. Essentially, one crop or another gets hit somewhere in the world and will impact the rest of the world. Typically, mustard seeds got impacted 3 years ago and in Canada, and as a result, Europe did not have mustard for practically a whole year. All this means that there is very quite clearly a push by all authorities, regulatory agencies at most levels, the European Commission, the SEC, quite notably in the US, have all been incorporating these obligations to mitigate, to guarantee a certain level of resilience into fiduciary and essentially all obligations that are usually being put on businesses and companies. So this is moving fairly fast, although at a bureaucratic speed. But for typical regulations, they are moving fast, and we can expect essentially by the end of this decade, at the very most, to see fairly strong regulations in terms of what emissions are allowed, what must be done in terms of offsetting them, and also what measures must be taken for resilience. So I think that's about it for my part. And if I should sum up the entire my entire talk, I would say that we are seeing climate volatility at unseen before levels. This is only going to get worse, much faster than expected. This is already getting worse, much faster than anticipated before. This doesn't just impact one part of the world or another. It does tend to propagate through supply chain to businesses literally everywhere. And on top of that, there is a systemic aspect to it. We are talking with climate change, not earthquakes in one part of the world, but with a type of physical event that tend to happen simultaneously in multiple places at once, which means that it is extremely hard to protect against it. You cannot really hedge your bets by relying on multiple suppliers rather than one supplier, because all these suppliers might get hit at the same time for the same reasons. So as a result, climate change is a very serious concern, not just as a human, but also as a business. You are likely to lose money and essentially to be affected by the effect of climate change, which I think opens up the next part of this webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave, for this this first part. And I mean, it really makes it very clear that now is really the time to act. We shouldn't wait any longer, and because as you mentioned, there are like amazing consequences and great big consequences, not only on nature but also on our businesses. So basically the question we'll try to answer is, okay, what do we do now? Again, as you mentioned, companies will need to reduce the impact they have on climate change. And how do you actually do that? How do you actually make sure that you prove that your impact was reduced? And one tool that is used is obviously carbon credits. So the idea in my part is to tell you a bit more about what it is and why it is so, I mean, the great variety of carbon credits that exists, because we put a lot of things behind the word carbon credits, but it can have like many aspects. So I'll start with a basic definition, and then we'll cover different concepts that are within this definition, so that you can really understand and make sure that you get the difference between the different kinds of carbon credits. So, of course, we always say it, the best carbon, better than carbon credits is like emissions that you do not produce. But when you do, you might want to buy carbon credits. So what is carbon credits? It's I'll start with a basic definition that you can see on the screen. It's a certificate that proves the avoidance or capture irreversible of 1 ton of CO2 equivalent through the implementation of an action that would not have taken place in the reference scenario. So here in this single definition, we've got different ideas, different concept. Like, do we talk about carbon credits or actually CO2? What is CO2 equivalent? What is the difference between avoidance and capture, take-based versus net-to-based? What is additionality, permanence, and so on? So we'll start with the very basics. What are we talking about? So first, it starts very well. It's not confusing at all. We talk about carbon credits, but the unit is CO2 is expressed in CO2. So carbon as such is not a problem. It's actually even like the foundation of life on Earth. It's almost everywhere, and it's just an atom. There's no problem in itself. Again, there is a lot everywhere, and it's a very common element. The issue is carbon dioxide, so CO2, which is a molecule. And the problem with this molecule is not that it's so present. I mean, they aren't like great. It's not the biggest gas in the atmosphere. But the issue with this molecule is that because of its structure, it will actually, when it vibrate, when it get exposed to infrared rays, which will generate heat. So that's actually thanks to greenhouse gases that we can live on Earth, because without them, without the atmosphere and this greenhouse effect, the temperature on Earth would be a lot, like, I don't know exactly the figure, but like well below 0. And thanks to this, the average is 15 degrees. So that's actually beneficial in a way. The issue is, as they mentioned, when we start actually putting too much in the atmosphere, because as you guess, more CO2, more vibration, more heat in the atmosphere, with all the consequences that were actually illustrated before. So here we talked about tons of CO2, and to be even more precise, we talk about CO2 equivalent, because of course, as you all know, there isn't only one greenhouse gas. There are many different, such as methane and so on. So the idea to get a common, because it's already quite complex, and we're talking about like physical flows and physical events. The market has actually decided like to go for the one that lasts the most, the longest in the atmosphere. So the CO2, which is a great indicator. And so basically, when you get emissions of another greenhouse gas, it might be expressed in CO2 equivalent, meaning like we take the potential of warming of this other gas, and we say, all right, to get the same potential with CO2, we will need that much CO2. So that's basically what we're talking about. And that's maybe the only thing that never changes in carbon credits is this unit. There is always 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. Now, to add a bit more complexity to carbon credits, we call carbon credits two things that are quite different. As you can see on this graph, there are 2 kinds of carbon credits. Some of them are, it says traditional offset, but basically it's what we call also avoidance. And avoidance means that you emit a ton of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere, but someone else somewhere doesn't do it while we actually expected they would emit this ton. And you pay them to have the right to claim the fact that they did not emit this ton of CO2. And so you can talk about neutrality because someone avoided an emission somewhere. But as you can see, there is still an additional ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. So physically, you've added like to the CO2 stock, if I may say, of the atmosphere, but you can still talk about neutrality. Then there are carbon removals, which are quite different in the sense that it means you emit 1 ton and this ton is actually captured back from the atmosphere. So one plus the other is actually equal to 0. So of course, it's never so easy. It's never exactly equal. It's not accounting, you know, it's like, again, it's a physical processes. But there, you actually take actions to actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And there you can not only talk about carbon neutrality, but about net zero. So when you hear companies claiming that they want to be net zero, it's not that they're going to buy some avoidance credits, but they will actually invest in projects that will actually allow you to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which is really crucial. Now, how do we avoid or remove CO2 from the atmosphere? It might be very diversified. There are many solutions that exist. Some of them are based on technology, and some others are on nature. So in both cases, it could be either avoidance or carbon capture. So, for instance, technology, you install like some wind turbines or solar panels to produce electricity that would have been produced by another technology that would be more polluting. Then you can generate some carbon credits, but you just emitted less than what was expected. Or to remain on the technology side, you can actually decide to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and then that would be with technologies such as direct air capture, so like a big Hoover absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. Then, if you want to rely on nature, just very briefly, you can have some what we call the RED plus or restauration tourbière, it's in French. So I mean restoration of wetlands, which means that you prevent an ecosystem from being destroyed, which would have emitted a lot of carbon, but as you protect these areas, you avoid this emission. And finally, carbon capture through nature. Well, they help many. I mean, there are many diversified projects, but essentially the best example is just you've got a land with no trees. You create a forest there. This will actually capture and sequester carbon in the long run. But we'll tell you more about this a bit later. Then we have this question of additionality. To be valid, a carbon credit needs to be additional. What does that mean? It means that these are a capture or the avoidance of CO2 equivalent that would not have occurred in a baseline scenario, right? Because if, well, there is, I mean, I don't know, you plan on doing something anyway, can you still generate a carbon credit from that? And so it can have like different aspects, either physical, which is the most straightforward. Same example as before, you've got a land with no vegetation, no trees, nothing, and you had some trees, obviously you planted, physically there were not much carbon stored there. And then suddenly you've got a big stock of carbon. So this is physical, biological. Then you've got the economic additionality. If it's profitable for you to actually invest in a project of carbon capture or that captures carbon like on the side, well, in a baseline scenario, as a rational investor, you would actually do it. So it is considered that you cannot claim additional carbon credits from such project because in a baseline scenario, you would still do it. And then you've got also the regulatory additionality, which means that if legally you are forced to take an action, I don't know, like use cleaner energy, or again, create a forest or restore an ecosystem, the baseline scenario is one where you actually respect the law and you don't do anything illegal, so you do your job to make sure that everything is all right. And then you wouldn't be able to claim additional carbon credits from that. But then additional as compared to what? Sorry, it's the next slide. Well, we'll get to that later. But then when we talk about removal or avoidance, we need to make sure that this removal or avoidance is actually permanent. Of course, we can't know everything, and permanent would mean theoretically forever. So, I mean, we can't see the future so far by definition, but it's just to make sure that the project you invest in are robust, because otherwise there's this joke, you would hold your breath for a few minutes and generate carbon credits from that because you did not emit it. But if you do, when you stop holding your breath, well, you still emit CO2. So, I mean, the capture or the capture of CO2 for only a while, if it's not very long term, is not valid to generate carbon credits. You would need to make sure that this capture is durable. There are many differences. There isn't like again, we are on the voluntary market, so there are quite a lot of definitions. Some people talk about like at least 7 years, which is quite short, or until 2050, or for 100 years or 1,000 years. So what we do, for instance, we choose to guarantee that we manage the forest for like 100 years. For avoidance, it's quite easy because once it's been avoided once, well, it's avoided for forever by nature. Right, then, so it needs to be permanent, additional, and to be additional, this needs to be measurable. I mean, you need to be able to prove exactly that there were that many tons of CO2 that were not emitted or that were captured as compared to the baseline scenario. Again, the baseline scenario being the one, like the status quo, what would have occurred without the project. So if you just say, okay, I guess it's going to be roughly X ton and so on, it wouldn't work. Obviously, we need to have concrete measures, and then these measures should be verified by a third party. Sometimes people distinguish between measurability and verifiability, but they are really the same, because if you cannot measure something, well, how can you verify it? Again, you need to make sure that the methodology that is used to quantify the CO2, and there are many for many different projects, are all are quite robust and allow you to double check to make sure that this is basically what was expected. So if we meet all these criteria, we can have a carbon credit associated to a project. But there is a last problem, which is, how can you make sure that several entities actually claim the same reduction or carbon capture? And there is this final characteristic, that is a unicity. We need to make sure that one credit is used by only one entity only once. So the way to do this, and the way we do this on the voluntary carbon market, is that each standard or certifier or project carrier actually keeps a registry saying, all right, this ton belongs to this entity and it has been consumed on that date and so on. So basically, you need to be sure that there is a registry, and each carbon credit has its unique ID, is only sold to you. So I hope, again, it's very complex, but just to give you an idea of the diversity of carbon credits that exist. There are as many methodology as project. Again, we are talking about like physical processes. So it's always models, proxies, and so on. So it might be a bit complex, but then what Arnaud is going to show you now is that behind carbon credits, there might be actual concrete projects, and that have an impact much more, a broader impact than only carbon capture. So to you, Arnaud.
Thank you, Pierre, for covering the basics of carbon credits. Indeed, we will have a look at how that works in forest-based carbon capture, and how we created the EcoTree methodology in order to satisfy these concepts of carbon credits. Next slide. So we are creating forests when we plant trees, and forests are pretty often called carbon sinks. So what is a carbon sink? It's a system that over a certain amount of time will absorb more carbon than it will release carbon in the atmosphere. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, does forest absorb carbon? Well, that's a yes. However, does forest release carbon? And well, that's a yes as well. So what does it mean at the end? Well, it's a question of balance and of time scale. As PA told you about, the question of permanence is directly linked to the amount of time CO2 is present in the atmosphere. It is a question of time, but not a question of scale, because as Dave told you, it's a global matter. So how do forests absorb carbon? Well, when you ask people about trees, they pretty much often or always agree that they are quite big and massive things. And if you ask them what are they made of, you get a variety of questions. And that is, of course, these are questions that scientists all over the time have asked themselves. John Battista von Helmont from Holland asked himself if it was not coming from the soil, because it's, well, as we are humans, we tend to think like humans, and well, if we eat something, then the tree must eat something, and it has access to the ground, so it must come from the ground. Well, it doesn't actually. And over the year, many experiences got done, and we finally managed to understand photosynthesis, which means that the trees, through the leaves or the needles, absorb CO2 and use it with the water that they get from the ground through the root, and break those and combine them again to make sugar, glucose. And there is a byproduct, which is dioxygen, which is good because we can breathe. And for that, they need energy, and that energy is taken from light. So basically, a tree eats CO2, drinks water, takes the light, and produces sugar and spouts dioxygen. Do they produce CO2? Yes, they do, because trees are living matter like we are, so they breathe, and so they intake O2 again, and then they use inside their cell the sugar they produced, and they burn it and create energy, and make wood and grow and produce chemicals and whatnot. And that is why it's at the same time a consumer of CO2 and an emitter of CO2. However, under certain conditions, forest is actually a carbon sink because it absorbs more CO2 than it releases. In France, the National Geographic Institution said that in 2020, 83 million tons of CO2 has been absorbed, which is quite a significant proportion of the 465 million tons which are emitted by France. So that is good. If we plant forest, if we manage forest, if we have good, healthy forest, we should be absorbing CO2. But as you've seen with PA, we have equations, so we need to quantify all that. And for that, we have a model, which is absolutely wrong, as all models, but they can be very useful because they can help us understand things. A model is like a black box, and you have entry data, input, and it spits out whatever you want to know. What we want to know is ton of CO2 equivalent, so we have to be able to compare things. And what are the inputs? The inputs are what foresters called yield tables, which is in a sense the amount of wood which can be used and taken out of the forest to create beams, pieces of furniture, whatever, over time. And that is what we decide when we plant a tree. We look at the soil, we look at the climate, and we say, okay, this is going to be a very good place to live for that tree. It's going to be very good fertility, and we have this volume of the trunk according to time. Then, once you have this, you can expand it to the crown volume with some equation, and then you can expand it to the root volume with another equation. And then you can transform that into tons of dry matter because, well, trees are mostly water, so you have to dry them in order to get to the dry matter. And then pretty much half of it is carbon. So we have basically a way to get from biomass to tons of carbon, and then you multiply it by 44 divided by 12, and then you have your equivalent tons of CO2. So that's how we can quantify how much CO2 is absorbed by a system. And it's not a tree. I insist on that. It's a tree block. It's a piece of land forested with one or many types of trees. It's impossible to know exactly what happens at the tree level, but empirically, we have models that are changing over time, but fairly robust, giving us the amount of volume that is on a piece of land, usually an hectare, over time. So we are happy. We have a way to quantify CO2. Next slide. However, when we speak about CO2 and trees, there are three things which are called the 3S. The first one is for sequestration, which is directly the biomass of living trees. If you have like 250 trees on your hectare, you look at them, you measure them, that's your sequestration, both in the trunk, in the crown, and in the roots. However, when you cut a tree and then you remove that piece of wood from the forest and transform it into a product, there you stock the CO2. It's not infinite. It degrades over time. First of all, because the CO2, the C in the wood degrades as an atom or as a molecule, and also because most of the products don't have an infinite lifetime, and they will be destroyed, burned at some point. So we use equations which are a bit like the same as radioactive decay to measure the amount of time the CO2 will be stocked and stored into products. And then there is substitution for the third S, which essentially explains that if you use a wood product, it's something that will be not made otherwise. Like if you use a beam out of an old oak, it's a beam that will not be produced not be produced in concrete or not be produced in steel or aluminum or whatever. So basically you save some carbons because the process of making those beams are detrimental or more detrimental to the environment than using wood, especially since, you can plant more trees after you cut the first ones. So it's important to know sequestration, stock, and substitution. So if you look at the next slide, you can see that it basically summarized the whole thing I told you about. The curve on the left-hand side shows some sort of a hedgehog. It goes up and then down a little bit, and then it stabilizes. Well, it represents the amount of carbon which is sequestered and stocked over time on a piece of land of 1 hectare. There is a curve which is more or less like a stair, and that is substitution because, it doesn't degrade. It just piles up. However, we don't at EcoTree add the substitution in our credits because, it's very fuzzy. The coefficients that are used to transform volume into tons of CO2 equivalent, etc., are not very well sourced, and we prefer to use it as a pedagogical aspect. So now let's cover the 4 different concepts that PA spoke about. I don't see the slide. Did they move one way? Yeah, right. So we have figures, and it's on the scale of tree stand, not on single trees, and over the time because it's a yield table. So it's over the time of the entire forestry project. Is this enough? And why usually when you go and see carbon credits for the forestry projects, they give you a final value? Why is there a final value? Well, everything comes directly from the 4 main concepts. Unicity, I'm not going to talk about it because it's a question of accounting. The additionality, as Pierre-Alexandre explained, is a reference, and we look at the amount of carbon which is absorbed in addition to the reference. So if the reference is a piece of land which is carrying crops such as corn or wheat, it sequesters some carbon, and we have to remove that if we want to plant trees on top. The reference scenario is we keep on growing crops, and our project is we grow a forest instead. The permanence I will cover later. because it's a little bit more complex. And the measurability is, as Pierre said, like we need to be able to measure what we're doing. And you've seen from the equation I described a little bit earlier that you can go back all the way to the volume of a tree, and well, that's the job of the forester, to go in the forest and measure trees. So basically, you can go from ton of CO2 equivalent all the way back to measuring trees. So it's measurable, and therefore it's quantifiable and verifiable. So the permanence now, we want to be sure that the carbon which is sequestrated stays there. However, we cut trees. So at some point, people might ask, well, it doesn't stay there because it's cut. And I've heard in the media that the forest is also becoming a carbon explosion of some sort. That's correct. However, it's possible to look at what is called the LTA, the long-term average stock. And it represents some sort of a theoretical maximum value that a forest can store. So for instance, at the beginning, you plant the trees, they grow a little, and then they grow more. And then at some point you cut the trees, and then you plant them again, if you follow the silviculture, which is called even-aged or regular. So you see that those little bars, they are the cumulative tons of CO2 equivalent. At the beginning, they're negative because we have yet to go over the reference scenario, and then they go over 0, and then it's all cut. And then there is this horizontal bar. The mathematical formula for that is that we add all the values of the vertical bars, and we divide by the amount of bars. It looks like an average. It's not. However, it means that over a very long time, if we repeat that process many times, if it would be constant, it would be to that value. There is something which is under. At some point, we go over. But over time, many times, at the infinite of times, it's as if we were at the LTA. Therefore, when you give carbon credits, you cannot go over, because if you give more carbon credits than there is above the LTA, well, those credits at some point, they are too much, because they will be disappearing and then reappearing and disappearing. You can go only all the way to the long-term average. However, at EcoTree, we don't do even-age forestry management. We try to do uneven-age forestry management, which is a type of silviculture that avoids doing the clear cut. So we try to manage the forest in a way that it reaches a steady state where essentially whatever is cut in volume is refurnished by natural regeneration. So you have old trees that get out of the forest, and small trees becoming older trees, even older trees, and new sprouts come. And basically in between each thinning, you remove exactly, or more or less, what's produced by the forest. And therefore, the LTA, the long-term average, is very easily understood as the average of this steady state, which is very long. I mean, for a new plantation of oak, for instance, you can reach the steady state well over 200 years. I mean, we are speaking about forestry here, which leads me to something which is interesting. At some point, there will be no other land that we can forest, right? I mean, we need to keep some land for crops, for cows, for cattle, for whatever. So we can't forest everything. But there is another way of looking at carbon, at additional carbon. If we transform the silviculture from even age to uneven age, then the reference scenario is what happens if we don't do anything. So we keep this, we plant, it grows, we cut, it plants, we plant, it grows, we cut. And then if we compare the two long-term averages, then we both cover the additionality and the permanence. And for some species, under some conditions, this delta LTA is positive, and it is additional carbon. And it is very good for the forest, right? Why? Why is it good for the forest? Because now that we have equations and a model, we could be, but that would be a little bit maybe arrogant, we could be tempted to optimize those curves and those equations to have more carbon, and that would not be a good thing. Why? Because a forest is a very delicate and complex system, and if we plant trees that grow very fast, they will probably have a bad impact on the soil because they will impoverish it. Your ecosystems might not be very resilient because if you optimize, you will have most probably only one species and one age, so you can harvest everything at the same time. And then if a bacteria, a fungi, or something wrong happens, like a big fire, everything will go in one type. The ecosystem will not be resilient. So optimizing carbon capture is not good. What we need to optimize is the life of the forest itself. In the next slide, you see what I mean by a forest. A forest is a multifunctional plural environment. It's not limited to carbon capture. Of course, it has the 3 S of CO2, sequestration, stock, and substitution. Stock is also showing off the economic aspects. Like there is a full business working around the forest with harvesters and lumberjacks and people making furniture. But it's also all the ecological aspects of the forest, like growing wood and growing moss and lichens and fungi. And there are also the social aspects of the forest. I'm sure you like to go and walk in the woods and pick up berries and mushrooms and all that kind of things. And also the forest has its own life, and it's a harbor for a whole variety of animals and plants and insects. And there are many other things, such as in mountains, it stabilizes the slopes, preventing landslides and avalanches in the winter. Close by a riverbank, you have erosion damping. I mean, the forest brings a lot more than CO2. So it's very important to, yes, use the forest as a CO2 sink, but also prevent it from being just a CO2 sink and be a nice environment on itself. I've been a little bit too long, I'm sorry, but I got carried away, as you said, Thomas.
Well, thank you very much to all the three of you. I suggest we use a couple of minutes for a few questions. Anyway, otherwise, again, feel free to engage with any of our speakers to answer your questions. Well, we have one question. Maybe I guess you've touched that aspect, Arnaud, in those very last minutes about what's our point, what's your point regarding bamboo forest versus tree forest for carbon sequestration? Indeed, I guess it's implied the optimizing solely carbon sequestration versus other benefits. What's your view on that? Well, you've touched it, but maybe specifically on that example of bamboo forest or monoculture forest.
Yeah, the monoculture forest is not really directly directed to carbon storage or carbon sequestration. It's mostly an economical issue. Because, well, as any other industry, you need to have a very important yield and make benefits. So you want to cut the costs. And if you standardize your process, mostly the cutting and the sewing, then you make more money and you can automatize and you have big equipment. That is bad in the sense of having a forest which is too similar. And therefore not very resilient. The resilience is when you have a shock and you look at the system and see if it gets back to what it was, or if it shifts and get to another regime, a little bit like what Dave showed in his part. So if you have a forest where you have all the trees with the same age and the same species, which is exactly what we had in the east of France with common spruce, When the pathogen is coming, which is the bark beetle, when it destroys everything in one go, because no tree is more resistant than the other because they're all the same. That's very bad. And if you adapt that concept to carbon sequestration, you would be tempted to plant something that grows very fast, and for economical reason, you would plant the same tree, and it would, yes, grow very fast, but probably will not be adapted, and it will not be very resilient.
Thank you, Arnaud. We have maybe time for one more question. How does the carbon removal potential of forest compare to other carbon removal technologies, such as direct air capture or carbon capture and storage? Maybe Pierre-Alexandre, you want to elaborate on that briefly?
Yeah, of course, but I think it actually continues what Arnaud just said. The thing is, like, such technologies can be useful, but they only address one problem, and the world is so complex, and there is not only the climate change, but also the biodiversity loss that is very concerning, and people are getting more and more aware of that. So again, today we focused on climate, but it's part of the problem. It's not the only problem that we have to face. So of course, these technologies can be useful. They can generate some carbon credits. But it's really important to be a bit humble in front of this complexity, and maybe try and solve several problems at once. And that's one of the key advantages of the forest, because it has different functions. It's not only, as Arnaud mentioned, it's not only a carbon sink, it's much more than that. It's the habitat for so much life, biodiversity, and he also plays some great roles in temperature, in everything. So it would be, I mean, technologies for CO2 capture, just in a nutshell, might be useful, but it only solves one problem, when in reality we face more than only one problem.
Thank you. And briefly, one more question for you. Is there a global register? You mentioned it's important to have a register to prevent double accounting. A question from a viewer: is there one global register? Or yeah, how does that work, very briefly?
No, there isn't. Actually, there are registries. Every standard has its own registry. Pretty much, you've got the Vera registry, you've got the gold standard registry, and so on. The only thing you can be sure about is that if one carbon credit is on one registry, it is certain that it's not on another one, because before adding it to a registry, you need to check with local authorities and other standards whether or not the project has been registered yet or not. And if it was, I mean, you can't just add it like twice. Again, that's the concept of unicity. But again, it's a very complex matter, as you've seen. That's why I was trying to illustrate that there are like so many methodologies for what we call carbon credits, so many different kind of carbon credits, and so there is logically quite a few standards, many methodologies to quantify different things, all expressed in CO2 equivalent. But there isn't only one registry. But again, hopefully it will evolve, especially in Europe. There will be some sort of standardization with the Green Deal, and we are hoping for more clarity on this market for the future.
Well, thank you very much. I think this comes to an end. Thank you again, Arnaud, Dave, and Pierre-Alexandre, for your time. Thank you all for joining. I hope you feel somehow better equipped when addressing climate change and carbon credits. Feel free to keep following us, EcoTree and Tenko, on the classic social and business media. And well, looking forward to hear from you soon. Have a good day, everyone. Cheers and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.